Welcome to another edition of Anglican Unscripted. This is episode 60 that you're watching. The world of Anglican news, all that happens around the world, is encapsulated in one show called Anglican Unscripted, and the funny stuff too. I'm Kevin Carlson.
And I'm George Conger. And today's December 19th, 2012.
George, we're going to move on to story one, and it's about tragedy, it's about evil. All of you pretty much know what happened, but let me give you a brief synopsis. I live in Connecticut. I live very close to Newtown, Connecticut. And Friday of last week at 9:30 in the morning, a young man in his 20s who had some pretty severe mental illness took guns into the school and killed 20 first graders and 6 staff at the school. It's a story we've seen before, especially here in America. We've seen it at theaters and schools and shopping malls. In the world, we've seen it in terrorism and other schools. I mean, evil is out there, and we got to experience that firsthand here in Connecticut. And, you know, sometime about 10 o'clock or 11 or noon, when you started to hear the news, you became a parent of a first grader because you were really able to feel the horror of that situation you couldn't control. You also probably know a teacher, and you felt that insecurity and the horror of being in that situation. And that's really part of the human anthropology, is being able to take those things in and absorb them and really react to them. And we react in so many different ways. I reacted by crying. Right over here in this corner, I sat and grieved for quite a while. I don't know if it's because of the proximity to Newtown, or is that just what my body was doing, or my soul was doing, or my spirit, but I just sobbed and sobbed for about an hour. George, people see you with a collar, and they come up, and what do they say to you, George?
Well, there's several questions. One of the least asked questions, but one that receives the most press attention, is, where is God in all this? Mm-hmm. In other words, if there's a good God, why would he allow evil into this world? That's very infrequently asked, but it is asked. Other people, basically their question is, what is a Christian response as opposed to a political response or a social response to this violence? And then I think the most common response that I have seen in people that I know and people with whom I'm affiliated with church is a realization that this is a fallen, broken world and that evil exists and Satan seeks to destroy us, and yet our trust and our hope rests not in laws, not in man, but in God. And this just refocuses our attention on God's omnipotence and our sole reliance upon him.
Yeah, and this isn't the first time this has happened. I grew up in the Midwest, and there was a town called Bath, Michigan, that was famous for a huge tragedy where I think 40 children were killed by an explosion set by the janitor, one of the people at the school. I don't remember all the details. And it didn't involve guns, but it did involve evil. It doesn't seem that the causation, the weapon is the problem. Evil is the problem. And we always look to put a face on evil. Charles Manson really helps in this, in circumstances like that. You look at Charles Manson and that's an evil face, or Adolf Hitler. That's evil. Look at the guy. Look, there's evil. And that's our problem as humans, is we want to put a face on evil. If you look at the 20-year-old who went into the school with weapons and horrifically shot first graders, you don't see evil in his face. You see loss, you see some emotion, expressionlessness, but it's not the Charles Mansons, it's not the Adolf Hitlers, it's not the Ted Bundys, it's not, what we would expect to see, because we as humans want to put a face on evil, and evil doesn't have a face, George.
It doesn't. And one of the hardest things for people, and well, when I preached on this topic yesterday, on Saturday evening, my bishop, Gregory Brewer of Central Florida, sent an email to all the clergy, and he directed us towards an essay that touched upon the brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky, and the suffering of innocence. In other words, and when I got up to preach on Sunday, one of the first things out of my mouth was that I'm not smart enough or clever enough to discuss theodicy with you all, which is the theory of evil. Yeah. I can't. There are some clever people who've written some very sound and sober books on this topic. And friends, also, if you want to know what they are, I'll tell you. All I can tell you, friends, is I don't know why this happened, but I do know what to do when this happens. And that is to turn to prayer and turn to God. Because God has not abandoned us in these tragedies. God is with us. He suffers with us. And He is there for us, no matter what evil this world brings.
Yes. I'm under the impression that Jesus is the Jesus who stood outside the tomb of Lazarus and grieved, who stood outside of Jerusalem and grieved. And grieving is a natural part of being a human when these things happen. There's something else that's natural, prayer. We talk about first responders as the policemen and the firemen and all that who arrive to a horrific scene. As Christians, we get on our knees and we are the first responders in prayer and doing the things that we do as Christians. And we really have to stop and say, what now? And I'll tell you, a good friend of mine named Moses will tell you, laws don't do it. You can pass all the laws in the world, and that doesn't stop evil.
One of the readings that we had in our church yesterday was from Paul's letter to the Philippians. Mm-hmm. And I took that as the theme of my sermon, and essentially the passage was, rejoice always, and again I say rejoice. Mm-hmm. In the midst of your sufferings, rejoice in the Lord. Thank Him for His providence. Thank Him for His goodness. Know that God is with you no matter what comes. See, the response to evil that a Christian must have, I believe, is to love. Our enemy is not Adam Lanza. Our enemy is not Adolf Hitler or Charles Manson. Our enemy is Satan. And Satan uses people to do evil in this world, but those people are still creatures of God, and we are to love them and to reach out to them. That doesn't mean what they've done is fine, but it still says to us that the response a Christian must make is love.
It really is. And, we're going to be examining, well, not us. We have the press to do it for us. But there are going to be lots of things you're going to hear over the next couple of months. Gun control. And, somehow at the school level, we treat it differently than at the airplane level. At the school level, you can't have any guns at all. But the hardest place in the world to get a gun is on an airplane, yet we have sky marshals to protect us. We're going to hear about mental illness. Well, yeah, mental illness is probably the biggest thing that George and I have both experienced together, and that's not at all being dealt with.
I, for instance, had a brother who was a young adult in his early 20s, developed schizophrenia. And he eventually took his own life with a shotgun. And as I look back, there was nothing that we could do as a family to get him medical treatment, because since he was over 21 and not an immediate threat or danger to anyone, and he was able to hold down a job, he was basically able to live his own life until finally his illness overcame him. Mm-hmm. Now, the number of mental health inpatient beds in this country has fallen by 95% since 1955. There are people on the streets who should be institutionalized because they're a danger to themselves. Of these rampage killings, the things that we're talking about today, the doctors tell us that over half of these rampage killings have been committed by people with severe mental illness who in another age would be in an institution. Now, that's locking up every person who has a mental disease is not the answer. But neither is picking up all the guns and dumping them into the Atlantic.
Well,
But it is an emotional
it
response.
is. The perfect world for me would be a gun-free world. The perfect world for me would be an evil-free world or a mental illness-free world. We don't live in that world. That's for the age to come. But we do have to deal with things as we do in this world. And you know, when we did have mental hospitals, we did it wrong. We just chained people to beds, performed experiments. I mean, it wasn't good. But we need to return to a place where we do medically help those who need medical help.
I've been involved peripherally with a ministry called Kairos, which is a ministry to people in prison. And if you go to the prisons, and I know Florida, many of the people in Florida's prisons should be in mental institutions. The mentally ill are no longer in state hospitals, they're in state correctional facilities because that's just how we warehouse people these days. The other thing that I think that people are going to ask themselves is, why does this happen in upper or middle class white suburban communities? Newtown, Connecticut, Aurora, Colorado, Columbine, Colorado, Altadena, the place in California. Mm-hmm. This isn't Chicago. This isn't Harlem. In other words, teen violence, a teenager is more likely to be killed in Chicago than any other place in the United States these days. These things don't happen in black inner city schools where violence is already endemic. They happen in Newtown, Connecticut, which is as far as our imagination could say it's as safe as a school can be. Why do these things happen only there and not in our poor schools or our minority schools? All these questions are the political questions our nation's going to face. But that's a different answer. And that's why I sort of get the creeps when I hear priests get up and talk about gun control from the pulpit. That's a political answer. It's not the Christian answer.
And if they're doing it for politics, they're doing it for politics. If that's their first emotional, if this is how you're dealing with it emotionally, I have no problem with gun control being part of a conversation. We allowed to talk about this because guess what? Our hearts were ripped out this week as an American nation because something happened beyond our control. And that's the nature of evil, is to put it out of our control and to think that God doesn't exist or can't control a situation. We now arrive to what now? What is our response now? We can't really prevent evil from happening in the future the way this happened. It's going to happen. I'm sorry. That's a reality. What is our response as Christians? Well, hopefully you're having these conversations in your home with your children. Not Newtown, but conversations where you're talking about real life, real issues. You're hugging them tighter. You're reading them bedtime stories. You're off of Facebook. You're doing all the things that you would want to do as a family. And that really I don't see a purpose in this, but I would want to make the best of the situation. And this is either the greatest Advent lesson in history, the greatest tragedy that could beset Connecticut, or a real time to sit down and reflect as a Christian, you, your family, your God, your church. George and I don't have the answers here, but the one we worship, the one we fall down on our knees before when we weep and grieve over these things, he does. And I thank God for that. George, I think we should let our viewers in on a little secret. This is actually the second recording of Anglican Unscripted, episode 60. We had recorded last Thursday, right before the Newtown tragedy, and due to technical difficulties and the tragedy, we decided not to put that episode up and re-record it another time, and this is that time. At that time, there was pictures floating about on Facebook with the pontiff, Pope Benedict, and an Archbishop, Duncan, and a Bishop, Sutton, and they were shaking hands and doing the things you do when you have an audience with the Pope. And A lot of people go, So, the possibilities. Duncan is going to swim the Tigris. Not a big possibility. The Vatican is going to endorse ACNA. Maybe, maybe not. But the thing is, when a picture goes out without a story, people get to do the rumors, and the office here in Acton has got to sit down and say, oh, wait, don't, no, yes, we met, we said hi, had the audience. George, what is an audience with the Pope?
Well, I think we need to sort of ground this story, and we'll start off with what actually happened that is public knowledge.
Okay.
I believe it was the 28th, the 29th of November, Wednesday. The Pope has a Wednesday general audience each week, where a large number of people come to the Vatican, and the Pope gives a little homily, and visiting celebrities or dignitaries are seated separately, and they're given a brief handshake and photo opportunity with the Pope. And 3 chairs before the larger crowd, and in these 3 chairs were Bob Duncan, Ray Sutton, and the 3rd chair was empty because one of the people who was to be there, Eliud Wabukula, the Archbishop of Kenya, had travel problems and wasn't through customs, I think, or immigration at Rome's airport when the service started. If that's it, then Bob Duncan had a really neat European vacation, got to meet the Pope, and had a really great seat, and he got to sit out front. However, we also know that private meetings were held afterwards with Archbishop Duncan, Archbishop Wabukula, other members of the ACNA team, and the Pope and officials from the Curia. And we have no clue what happened in those private meetings.
Wink, wink. Really, I mean, we do need to stop the story here. Something happened. One day you'll get to hear about it. And I do imagine it's going to be some very big news because of all the hush-hush about what happened. If it were just a general, well, we had coffee, tea, and shared a biscuit, we would have heard about that. When you don't hear about something big happened, and let's just see what happens and let the news play out. And maybe in a future interview I have with the Archbishop, we'll get the details. George?
Now, we should give a little bit of context here.
Uh-oh.
In October of 2003, there was something called the Plano Conference,
Correct.
which actually took place in Dallas, Texas. But
Right.
I was there, and at that meeting, this was just before the consecration of Gene Robinson as Bishop of New Hampshire. It was really the first national gathering of conservative Episcopalians who were upset with the way the church was going. And at this meeting, Bob Duncan presented a letter written by Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger.
Who's that?
That's the man they now call Pope Benedict.
Okay.
At the time, he was the number 2 in the Vatican, president of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, I believe was his title. And he wrote a letter on behalf of the Pope, affirming and giving the Catholic Church's blessings and good wishes for the renewal and reform of the Anglican Church, the Episcopal Church of the United States. So Cardinal Ratzinger has, on his own initiative, stepped into Anglican affairs. He was the one, after years of fiddling around with the ordinariate idea, he was the one who decided, okay, we're going to go with it. And so now you have an Anglican ordinariate led by Jeffrey Steenson, the former Episcopal Bishop of the Rio Grande. It's now part of the Catholic Church. It's doing well. It's had a very good first year. Benedict has his eye on the Anglicans, and we've had several public examples of this, but we don't know what's next.
No, we don't. But let's be honest. The Pope wants Anglicanism to succeed in its traditional Orthodox form. No question about that. There's no reason that the Pope would not want us to succeed. And he may find success in what's happening here in the Anglican Church in North America and in GAFCON. And in doing so, we may hear some news about that. Interesting story, and that's the good part of being a reporter, is we get to dig these things up and see what goes on, George.
Other little bits that you would want to work into this is, remember, the Pope has made several recent statements that he believes that the future work and effort of the Roman Catholic Church should be in Africa, because Africa is the growing continent for the Christian faith. And because we're Americans, we like to put Bob Duncan or an American focus on things, remember Eliud Wabukula, the Archbishop of Kenya, is the head of GAFCON, the leader of the Global South Coalition of Archbishops. He was supposed to be at that general audience. He didn't make it, but he was in the private meetings. So who is really the focus here? Is it an ACNA-focused meeting, or is it a GAFCON-focused meeting with the Pope? Lots of stuff to think about. And we'll let you figure it out, because we can't tell you what's going on.
Stay tuned, though. George, let's move on to story 3. We're going to talk about the artificial diocese of South Carolina. Let's not confuse you. Let's back up a step. There is an Episcopal Diocese of South Carolina. It has a bishop named Bishop Mark Lawrence. It has a standing committee. It has lots of churches. It has 29,000 congregants. It's an Episcopal diocese. It has voted to leave the Episcopal Church and General Convention and separate itself, but maintain its seal, maintain its title, maintain its staff, and be itself. It hasn't changed anything except an affiliation to the Episcopal Church. Well, that leaves the Episcopal Church with a slight problem. They have no representation now in South Carolina. What do? And it's a catch-22, because the presiding bishop, Catherine Jefferts Schori, is under the impression, a false impression, clearly, that a diocese or a church cannot leave the Episcopal Church. Only people can, and boy, do they. So here we are. What can she do, George? She has basically 2 options.
Well, the presiding bishop has called a special convention. She has convened a special convention for January in Charleston, and at that special convention, she believes the Episcopal Diocese of South Carolina will elect a new standing committee and elect a provisional bishop. There are several problems with this scenario that she has laid out. The first is that she has no authority to call a convention. Only the standing committee can call the convention. Mark Lawrence may be deposed from the ministry of the Episcopal Church, but the clergy and the standing committee of South Carolina have not been deposed. Well, you can say they're no longer in the Episcopal Church. Well, if that's the case, and therefore it's vacant and all this and that, well, if that's the case, the whole diocese is gone, because the diocese as a legal entity voted to withdraw. Mm-hmm. And then she's got to start over and create a missionary jurisdiction. And basically, she's taking a canonical shortcut, trying to have it both ways. She's acting as if the diocese can't leave, but that she's also acting as if it has left.
Well,
and it's just junk. It's just nonsense.
And what does this mean to viewers? She's been in control of the General Convention in the Episcopal Church since 2006. They recently, 2 conventions ago, completely rewrote Title IV to make it so much easier to depose a bishop like Bishop Mark Lawrence, one of those evil Orthodox guys. And even with that perfect canon written the way she wanted it written, she didn't use it. She improperly used the canon. And so it shouldn't be a big surprise that she's going to go into the South Carolina and not use the rules of the church. I'm not surprised. Certainly you're not surprised. And it makes for great press. However, the bigger problem is all these other bishops in the Episcopal Church have the authority to say, hey, wait a minute, presiding bishop, excuse me, why you can't do that? And nobody's saying no anymore. They used to kind of say no a year ago, but really ever since the Anglican Church in North America is formed and the moderates and Orthodox pretty much left en masse, nobody says a word.
Well, what we've adopted in the Episcopal Church is a doctrine of the ends justifying the means. The canons are to be used to achieve a political end. We're not a church governed by the rule of law anymore. We look at General Convention. The introduction of same-sex blessing rites was done contrary to the canons of the Episcopal Church. This was raised by canon lawyers, canon experts, and, well, the Episcopal Church, the bishops knew it, but it didn't particularly matter much because they were going to do it anyway. Now, Mark Lawrence and the Diocese of South Carolina have left the Episcopal Church. Well, the Episcopal Church wants to reform the Diocese of South Carolina, but it's doing it in such a way that is contrary to the canons. Now, it's perfectly justified to basically create an entity for those people in South Carolina who do not want to be part of Mark Lawrence's show. But by doing it in a way contrary to the canons, you're reinforcing this reputation the Episcopal Church is ridiculous. It's not a serious institution. It's an institution where we have a 225-year history of being a sober, intellectually rigorous, legally profound institution that in the last 5 years has become a joke. How can you take Presiding Bishop Catherine Jeffery Shorey seriously? I can't.
Seems all the other bishops in the church still can.
Well, what does that say about them?
Regular viewers have heard George and Kevin talk about something called Arctic. And it's not in Norway, it's not in Greenland. It's actually a kind of a convention between the Roman Catholics and the Anglicans where they get to talk about things they have in common. And we have a lot in common. We wear robes, some of us wear cassocks, and I guess it's fun to get together and talk about those things. And recently we had one over, was in Japan? Where was the last one? China?
Hong Kong.
Hong Kong. Sorry. And the Roman Catholics and the Anglicans got together around tables and talked about things they have in common. And an interesting thing happened there where an Anglican really didn't represent what we believe as Anglicans, and it was a whole mishmash. What was that about, George?
Well, the Arctic meeting was to discuss common moral, ethical teachings. Anglicans and Roman Catholics differ on contraception, for example. The Roman Catholic Church, its Humanae Vitae encyclical, says contraception is contrary to God's will, while Anglicans, since the 1930 Lambeth Conference, have affirmed that contraception within marriage is appropriate. So there are differences, but one of the things that was raised as a difference this time around was that David Moxon, the Archbishop of New Zealand, said, and oh, by the way, we disagree on the morality of homosexuality. You Roman Catholics think that homosexual behavior is intrinsically disordered and is morally wrong. We Anglicans don't think so at all.
Oh, wow. What does that mean? Well, to the Anglican Unscripted viewer, let me remind you of something called Lambeth 110 from 1998, where all the bishops of the church got together and had one common understanding of homosexuality, marriage, and Scripture, and the compatibility or incompatibility of it. And that is the teaching of the church. George, Lambeth 110, you wrote it up. What's it say?
No, I typed it. There's a difference. The Lambeth 110 document, I actually was the typist for the group that prepared it. So Lambeth 110 said that homosexuality is contrary to God's purpose for humanity.
According to Scripture.
According to Scripture.
And one of the things here is we have a Anglican representative who doesn't believe in Lambeth 110 or doesn't understand that Anglicans hold to the traditional Scripture understanding of human sexuality. Well, obviously he probably got demoted and he's back to New Zealand and probably living in some small condo, serving as a dean. George, you don't look convinced. There's different news here. What's going on?
Well, guess who the new Anglican representative to Rome is? Archbishop David Moxon. So somebody who represents the extreme liberal wing of the Anglican Communion, Rowan Williams, and one of the last things he does before he takes off at the end of this month, he gives a job to one of the boys.
Yeah.
Here's a cushy little spot for you. You get to live in a nice house, a former palace in Rome. You get to hobnob with the Vatican. You get to be taken seriously. And, oh, by the way, you don't have to be a representative of all of the wider Anglican world. In fact, you can teach things that are contrary to the Church's received doctrine. But here's a nice job for you before I head out the door.
So
Jobs for the boys, Kevin. Jobs for the boys.
in our previous story, when we talked about the audience with the Pope and Archbishop Duncan and Bishop Sutton, the Archbishop was, or the Pope was actually meeting people who believed in Lambeth 110. So it's kind of exciting, I bet.
Well, we'll basically see what the next few months bring. It is going to be an exciting time, I should say so.
Via the magic button, Skype, via the internet, via all things holy and good, I have on the line Peter Old from Canterbury, England, and we're going to talk about the latest. It's kind of Canterbury's Trails to the 21st Century.
It is. That's a good title. Let's patent it.
Because let's talk about what's happening in the last 4 or 5 weeks is the subject of same-sex marriage is becoming louder and louder and louder, primarily because your prime minister is all for it, although people wouldn't think it because it's conservative, yet right now it's very hip to be pro same-sex marriage in England.
Yeah.
And so if you're a hip priest, if you're a hip bishop, if you're a hip archbishop, this is the way you want to go. The problem is the gospel. What are you going to do about it? What's going on now, Peter?
Okay, so on Tuesday, the government released, firstly, released its response to the consultation that it did on same-sex marriage. And then it released, basically said, yeah, and we're going to push forward in the new year with some legislation to make it happen. And I know, and how exciting for us. And the Church of England and the Church in Wales, which is the disestablished national church in Wales, are slightly up in arms because basically the government has decided to protect the Church of England by imposing upon it certain laws that it never asked for. And we had a magnificent Church of England press release and then statement from one of the leading bishops using this wonderful word, omnishambles. Apparently, what the government has done is a complete omnishambles. And you know what, mate? It is. It's complete omnishambles.
Well, let's bring our viewers up to speed. England is different than all other places, and it always has been, always will be, because you're a church state. Okay, the church and the state operate and function under the same umbrella of some rules and stuff like that. And you have the Queen overseeing all of it, but more of a figurehead. And so, if the state's doing something, it kind of implies that the church is endorsing it.
Yeah, and the problem was that church law, canon law for the Church of England is national law.
Right.
You know, it is the law of the land. So the canon law says that marriage is only between a man and a woman. And the state law is about to change to say marriage can be between any two people. And there's a slight conflict there. So what the Church of England said to the government in its consultation was, we want to have legal safeguards in place so we won't be sued for not doing same-sex weddings, because you have a legal right in England, if it's your first marriage, to get married in your parish church.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So this is the crucial point. The Church of England said to the government, we want to have assurances that we won't be sued. Talk to us about those. And what the government says is, we're going to introduce a law that bans the Church of England from conducting same-sex marriages. So think of the perversity of what the government's doing, okay, Kevin? The government says it's going to protect our religious freedom, and in doing that, it's telling us what we can and cannot do. Genius!
No, I live in America where it's twice as worse as twice it could be. Now, let's back up a couple steps here. And we understand that the government's trying to have safeguards for the church, but they do have this thing that says any two people who love each other can get married. But they don't put any limits on that. So a brother could marry his sister.
No. They will still have the same kind of restrictions. Though, interestingly, once you start getting into the meat of the government's response, you see, this is not equal marriage. Everyone's saying, let's have equal marriage. No. So, for example, Home Office lawyers, that's like the State Department or something, right. I don't know, Department of the Interior. Home Office lawyers have been getting into a real tangle over defining consummation for a same-sex couple, okay? Because in English case law, right, consummation for 150 years has been defined very clearly, and I won't describe it, but basically, if you do that, that's consummation, okay? Now, I don't want to freak your viewers out, but 2 men, 2 women, that's not quite possible. So, how do you define consummation? Well, in the end, they've gone, hell, we're not going to. We're just not going to have consummation for same-sex couples. How is that equal, Kevin? How is it equal to say, if you get married by the same law, if you're an other-sex partnership, your marriage can be discounted if you don't consummate it, if one of the parties says so. But if you're a same-sex couple, you can't get your marriage discounted because of non-consummation, because we can't quite bring ourselves to define what consummation is in a manner that would cover same-sex and other-sex couples at the same time. It's not equality. How is that equality?
Well, currently, believe it or not, we have equality. Every person on the face of the earth can marry a person of the opposite sex. That's equality.
This is what I've been getting into arguments with, and I've kind of drawn away from this line of argument in the last few years, and now I've come right back to it. And it's simply this: when someone says to me, I believe that 2 people who love each other should be able to get married, I say, great, let me introduce you to Betty and David, who live just down the road. They're brother and sister, they're adults, they're consensual, they want to get married. And they go, no, ooh, that's disgusting. And I'm going,
goodies.
And yet I'm not allowed to oppose same-sex marriage. And, you know, so obviously there is no right in law, and in fact I've been challenging quite a few people when they say, I want the right to marry the person I love, to say, where is that law? It doesn't exist. We define marriages between a man and a woman. They might happen to fancy each other, but the law doesn't require that.
Well, I'm going to take
That's my doorbell going.
That's all right. You can't answer it yet.
I can't answer it yet.
Let's take this a step further. And you're familiar with canon law in the church, what it talks about marriage. Tell me anywhere in the canon law where it says love is part of the definition of marriage.
Well, what's interesting is when you look at the New Testament, when it talks about love between a man and a woman, it's not eros.
Right.
So husbands, love your wives. It's not erotic love. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't fancy your wife. I quite fancy my wife. I don't know about you, Kevin.
We're not going to talk about
how it goes. But you know, that's not what that's not like, you know. It's not. It's part of marriage, but it's not everything. There is no right to marry. But you see, this rights thing is really interesting. Okay, because the government is saying, oh no, we're going to protect the Church of England, blah, blah, blah. But there is a higher court that we are answerable to here in this country. That is the European Court of Human Rights. Mm-hmm. Well, so what's going to happen, Kevin? And there are gay activists who are already saying, we're going to do this, okay? What's going to happen is this. The law will come in. The Church of England will be forbidden for marrying same-sex couples, but at the same time has a legal obligation to marry other sex couples who live in the parish. You're going to have a same-sex couple who will go, well, we want to be married in our parish church. We don't see why we should not be allowed to do that. They will take it to the European Court of Human Rights. And if the European Court of Human Rights will go, well, if straight couples have the right to marry in a Church of England church, you have a legal right, why shouldn't same-sex couples? Well, and there have been a number of legal opinions which have basically said this is what is going to happen.
Well, that's interesting because the French, have already come and said, no, we ain't going down this road because we don't understand how this could be presumed to be marriage. If the definition is love, I have the ability to love more than one person. Can I have 2 wives and a couple husbands? And where do we stop when we allow love to be the single definition or desire to be the definition of marriage? And when you see the French, say no, why can't the Church of England say no?
Well, there's a real backlash against Francois Hollande in France, who wants to bring in these moves. He may still go ahead and do it. There's a real backlash here in the Conservative Party, where there are some constituencies that are seeing a complete loss of membership. You know, there's a very good opinion polling firm that has basically been doing polls of voters and finding out this is actually a vote loser for the Conservatives. So why are they going ahead and doing it? I have no idea.
Okay, let's step back again. All right, you've been really good with predictions. You were able to predict the last 4 or 5 votes that there would be women bishops. The last,
Not bad, was it?
yeah, the last one you were way off, but you're 4 for 5.
Yeah.
When we sit down next Advent and light our little pink candle and talk about how the year went,
Yeah, sorry, go on, yes.
will we be doing that with men and women being married together? Or will it be same-sex
Here in England?
In England?
I suspect this is going to sail through the Commons, but with a big rebellion from the Conservative Party. And watch what will happen if over half of the backbenchers, who are basically Conservative Party members who don't have a government role, watch what happens if over half of them vote no. That would be a major moment of a crisis for the Conservatives. It will fairly well sail through the House of Commons because the opposition parties are in favour. When it comes to the House of Lords, it may be a lot trickier and it may bog down. So I suspect, in terms of getting a law passed and getting it in place, this time next year, no. In 2 years' time, assuming that we haven't had a parliamentary election before then because the coalition breaks down over something like this, yeah, we will have same-sex marriages, and we will probably have the first test case against the Church of England going through the legal system as well.
Last question. Elephant in the room. Lambeth, 1998. All of the Anglicans got together and decided on the teaching of the church would be Lambeth 110.
Yes.
That's your church, Church of England. Signed by most of the people that are still in office as bishops and clergy in your church. How do you have that on the books and have your church state go forward with same-sex marriages?
Well, you know, this is part of the legal compromise that they're trying to find out, because canon, I think it's canon B30, explicitly says marriage is the union between a man and a woman. So how does that go forward? Once again, I think that will be part of the legal challenge. It will basically be there is a contradiction now in law. It could lead to disestablishment. That may come over a number of different things. You know what? I just don't know. I don't know how it's going to pan out. The Church of England is its official line is pretty conservative on this. There's a large minority that wants to change. I don't think they will get their way, but in the process of not getting their way, we're going to have an awful lot of trouble.
Now, I've understood recently the Archbishop Rowan Williams spoke before the World BBC 80th anniversary, and he said, press is great up to the point that it is offensive. So apparently Peter.Old is being shut down. Anglican TV obviously isn't going to meet muster with the Archbishop of Canterbury. You guys really have trouble with the limits of freedom.
We are having a real debate in this country at the moment about that in the media. You know, we have the Leveson inquiry. We've certainly had a lot of newspapers doing very naughty things, but I wonder whether those things cannot be handled under the law of the land as it is. You know, if you hack into somebody's phone and that's not legal, then you sue the person on the basis of that. If you falsify information, then you take them to court under a fraud law. I'm not sure what a separate media law has to do with that. But hey, let's come over to your neck of the woods where we can have God hates fags placards everywhere and offend the hell out of everybody. And just for the record, I do not approve of the Westboro Baptist Church.
Well, and you know, they do take freedom of speech to extreme, but here in America, our freedom of speech is limited to what you can't scream fire in a crowded theater.
Yes.
Okay, we have limits to our freedom of speech.
Yes.
But Westboro Baptist, their limits, they have to be 300 yards from any funeral.
Yeah.
And so we do put limits. You are allowed to speak. Are not allowed to be heard. You don't
Yeah.
have the right to be heard.
And interestingly, Section 5 of the Public Order Act, which has been used and abused in this section, there's a bill now going through Parliament, just gone through the House of Lords now, which is basically saying, actually, we should have the right to offend people. You know, I should have the right to tell you something that is offensive, as long as it's not aggressive, as long as it's not, you know, you need to put up with the fact, mate, that I could insult you, and that's just how it is. I may not make many friends, but that's, you know, that's okay.
Well, I got to wonder where the first century church would have been if they could not have offended anybody. You know, there's certain limitations we need to, as Christians, be very wary of. Peter, thank you for your time. We're going to skip next week. We're taking a week off. Enjoy the time with your family.
Is something happening next weekend?
Yes, the doctor's having outpatient surgery. They're going to take half my thyroid out for whatever reason, and he says I can't do any heavy lifting. And I say, Doc, all I have to do is lift a little remote control and push the record button. So can't do that. No, not allowed to do that. So I'll be in recovery for a week, and we're taking the week off. Enjoy the time with your family. Thank you so much for your contribution this year, Peter. It's been great having you, and look forward to working with you in the future.
How to take, Kevin.
George, let's close out the show. Some great news. There's a brand new Archbishop of the province of Uganda. His name is Stanley
Ntagali.
I'm sorry, I can barely get an American name like Smith. How am I going to get Ntagali? Stanley Ntagali. I met him, I think, at the New Wineskins Conference. He's going to be a great Archbishop. He replaces the great Henry Arambi, who to me is one of the taller primates in the Anglican Church, but I'm only just recently found out I'm no longer 5'6", I'm 5'5". I'm getting old, George. I'm shrinking, and nobody else seems to be shrinking. So let's close out the show here. Let's talk about our Christmas list. You and I were having fun with this last week, and it never made it to tape, but let's make it to tape. We were talking about what we'd like to see at the new GAFCON for Christmas. And one of the things we talked about was location. The GAFCON's really trying hard to put itself back into a holy site where you can go, and if you're part of the tours, you get to go see the place where Mark walked his first dog, or where Matthew did whatever, you know. And so they like to do that because it brings in the people to come to the conferences, and that's understandable. My understanding is, once you've been to Jerusalem, you go out. And the call of Christ was to leave Jerusalem and go into all the world. And you and I were talking about where the church really isn't, or where the established church really isn't, and that's China.
Yeah, one of the last episodes, we discussed the death of K.H. Ting, the last Anglican bishop of China. Now, one of the things the GAFCON movement has been working on is to foster relations with the Three Self-Patriotic movement, which is the Chinese State Protestant Church. That's different from the house church movement. GAFCON has been trying, by being positive, to help the Three Self-Patriotic movement come together with the house church movement and help spread the good news of Jesus Christ in China. My argument, and the argument that we've had, that we both agree on, is that GAFCON shouldn't be looking back. It shouldn't be an example, it shouldn't be ecclesiastical tourism. Come talk, hear some bishop speaks, then go look at the pretty sights. GAFCON, if it were a congress, if it were a gathering of people who are already energized by the good news of Jesus Christ and brought into a situation where their skills and abilities and talents can work together and sort of germinate and be in a place like Shanghai, or in India, or in Southeast Asia someplace, a place where the church is alive and going and exploding outward. That's I think, a better way for GAFCON to focus itself.
It is, because you look at China as a perfect example. China, probably looking at 270 million Christians. They're in underground churches. They don't have a common theology. They're susceptible to heresies. They're susceptible to the name it and claim it type stuff that goes on around the world. And there's a great opportunity here for something like Anglicans to walk in with an established episcopacy and help set up churches in China, which is much more open now under the new capitalism that's going on there, to this type of organization. They don't fear Christians like they used to, and it's an opportunity. GAFCON would do very well there.
And if not China, put it in Harare. Now that Norbert Kanunga has been kicked out and the church in Harare is starting to come back on its feet again, they need, after 5 years of being in the wilderness, the Anglicans of Harare would benefit, as would the African continent benefit from a focus of the church's evangelistic efforts in a really unpleasant place.
So that's our Christmas wish, GAFCON in China. But it's interesting because, we're not on the planning committee or anything like that, but we have a lot of talk that's off the camera, and I thought this would be a good one to put onto the camera, because really repeating yourself isn't what Christianity is about. Replicating yourself is what Christianity is about.
Now, one of the things that Anglicans agree upon is this Lambeth Quadrilateral, written in the late 1890s, 1898. It basically sets out what sort of the minimum parameters of Anglicanism is. And one of those minimum parameters is the episcopate locally adapted. And if we can reach out to people such as the Three Self-Patriotic Movement, such as the churches in Africa, who are differing in some respects from the traditional American or the English way of doing things, we can help spread the good news of Jesus Christ and use the strengths of Anglicanism to build up the kingdom.
This has got to be the longest show closing we've ever done, George. That's because we had such big Christmas lists. Okay, so on to the rest of the show closing. I'm going to do a repeat this week of my favorite websites. AnglicanRSS.com is a website that I set up that is an RSS feed of all the Anglican news sites. Years ago, my day would be spent going to Stand Firm, Virtue, Titus, Church of England, Living Church, and so you type in those all day long, and you're just going through the news cycles of all the different places. AnglicanRSS.com puts all those into one and lists all the stories as they're posted. You just click on the story, it takes you to the website. It's a simple way to have your own Anglican RSS feed. And George, you're part of the RSS feed, of course. George, we really came and tripped upon something very interesting. We always beg for donations, and we have limited success. We found something new that's working. What do we call those, Georges?
We're asking people to pledge. We're asking people not to support for one-off trips. Right. Kevin and I were invited to stand in this past week, but we couldn't swing it because we didn't really have the time, and people didn't want to put up the money for us to go there. However, we found that if we asked for pledges for the year for the operations, instead of funding specific trips, fund the operations, then Kevin and I can decide how to allocate our funding that we receive. We don't receive salaries, but we do need equipment, we do need travel expenses, we do need to pay our way.
Yeah, we do. And the interesting thing about pledging is we really need to get beyond just having the viewer pledge. We need to get church level and diocesan level and province level pledging. Anglican TV, as you are well aware, is a wonderful ministry. It exists further beyond than the people who push the record buttons or the people who edit the video or the commentators or the Anglican Inc. sister site. Anglican TV Ministries is an incredible resource to get out Orthodox, traditional Anglicanism based on Lambeth 110 and all those other good ones. And it's a great way to support what you like. And so we're asking for people to pledge. You can go to, Anglican, I don't even speak English, so I don't know why you want to pledge anything. AnglicanTV, Anglican.tv/donate, and I'll have their instructions on how to do a pledge for next year. I would love it if churches would start pledging. If a church would give $100 a year, that would be a great way to help us have a budget. I've established Anglican TV in 2006, And I've not had a yearly budget yet because we just do needs-based donations, and it's time to change our methodology of serving you. I'm Kevin Carlson.
And I'm George Conger, and you've been watching episode 60 of Anglican Unscripted.
Good.